And I let you manage with Manon, Almo, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Oliver Metcalf, who is from the UK and who is going to talk about acoustic indices performance. So if you can, Oliver, start, it would be great.
Yeah, I'm just share screen. There we go. Okay, are you seeing that okay? Or?
Yes, it's quite difficult to put it. Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
Great. Hi, I'm Oliver Metcalf. I've just finished a PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University using ecoacoustics to monitor the impact of forest disturbance on biodiversity in the Amazon rainforest. And happily, I'm going to continue those studies as a postdoc, still at Manchester Metropolitan. I'm going to talk to you today about using acoustic indices at ecologically meaningful time and frequency scales. It's quite a methodological presentation, so I thought I'd just present a little bit first about the conservation and research context that the work is happening in. So we work with the sustainable, well, we're part of the Sustainable Amazon Network, who are based in the Brazilian Amazon. My research area is in Santarém, which is in Eastern Amazonia. As you can see, the region is quite heavily affected by deforestation. But actually, a lot of our research focuses on the impact of forest disturbance and degradation rather than outright deforestation and the impact that it has across the entire forest matrix, landscape matrix. So disturbance is when there is forest left standing, but it's degraded. And it can have a very severe impact. It can affect a very large area, and we found that when you include disturbance as well as deforestation across per our state, which is massive, then biodiversity loss is actually doubled. So when we talk about disturbance, what we generally mean is forest fires that all have anthropogenic sources. And logging. So in our region, that's both legal and supposedly low impact logging and illegal logging. And we have 28 permanent transects across an area that's about 1 million hectares. And they've been there for 10 plus years. We have all sorts of great ecological data from them. And that's where we have our acoustic recording. So I was keen to use acoustic indices to characterize the different and differentiate the land use types, the different levels of forest disturbance, and as a proxy for traditional diversity metrics. So when I started this work back in sort of 2018, I was reading the literature, and it seemed like acoustic indices were good at differentiating very different land use types, but at times they were not so great at distinguishing between, say, coniferous and deciduous forest, or very similar land use types like we might find along our degradation gradient. And that also it still seemed inconsistent at predicting the traditional diversity metrics or as proxies for those. And I wondered if signal masking played a role in that, if there was some sort of signal masking that was limiting the sensitivity and fidelity of acoustic indices. So just to explain what I mean by signal masking, because there's obviously lots of different sorts of ways that signals can be masked. I'm talking about, in my mind, quite a specific sort of ecological masking. So if we look here, a very hypothetical example that I'm just going to walk us through here. It's completely artificial. But you imagine this is our primary intact rainforest. We've got a lovely soundscape there with lots and lots of diversity going on. So in my made up indices that works, it's supposed to be a proxy for real indices, but just very broad, we've got quite high scores. We've got high scores across all the way, lots of noise, lots of everything going on. So if we take a degraded landscape where fire's gone through that forest and now we have fewer species, there's a lot less diversity, there's a lot less sound. And our score is now lower. That makes sense. Our indices score is lower in this lower richness, lower diversity landscape. But actually, what I was thinking about was that perhaps, perhaps that's not quite how diversity works when this happens, because you lose your insectivorous birds, but maybe insects increase because they're released from this pressure. So in fact, rather than having a soundscape that's all quiet, that's much quieter everywhere, you get a soundscape that's quieter in some parts and louder in other parts, and diversity increases in some places and decreases in others. So in that case, what happens if you get the same score as the intact landscape, because you've got higher in the top frequencies and lower scores in the lower frequencies? So that would sort of mask those ecological signals of what's happening on the landscape. So what I wanted to find out was, does this masking occur? If it does, what impact does it have? And can it be reduced by measuring indices at narrower time frequency bins that reflected the ecological niches that these that species call at? So the first thing I wanted to do was determine some narrower time frequency bins to measure acoustic indices at, which in the paper is based on a large amount of literature review, but in reality was based on me spending hundreds and thousands of hours of looking through my own data for a separate classification project to find training data, and just observation of what the primary components of different frequency bins at different time periods were. So for example, at dawn, between sort of 0 and 6 kilohertz, you primarily got birds. At night, between sort of 4 and 8 kilohertz, you primarily got insect noise. So I came up with this sort of rough schematic of what groups were calling roughly at what times. So I think the top row here is sort of a baseline of how people measure indices. So 0.3 to 22.05 kilohertz. I think often it would be maybe capped at 12, but still broad frequency bins. And then I also measured them at 12 to 22.05, which is primarily for insects and bats, 0.3 to 12, 4 to 12, and 0.3 to 4. And we've used different temporal bins as well, so dawn, day, dusk, and night. So our baseline frequencies, we didn't use all time periods, so this one didn't exist in our study on the far right here. And our baseline period are when we've measured the entire frequency band from 0.3 to 22.05. So we collected continuous audio data from each point. We removed files containing rain using the hard rain package, which you can check out here. It's a little R package we wrote up. And then we used acoustic complexity and the bioacoustic index to measure values from 100,000 randomly selected 10-minute intervals. We chose those indices because they're very commonly used and they seem to be quite effective. And that translates as roughly 500 values, 500 index values per time frequency bin per forest class per index. That's about 80 hours. So that's about 2/3 less than is recommended in the Tom Bradford-Lawrence guidelines. So does measuring acoustic indices cause signal masking? So what we did was we did a Kruskal-Wallis test on those values, on those indices values for each of the forest class pairs, and then did a Dunn's test to check how many different pairs were different within them. So we have 5 different forest classes. We have primary forest, logged forest, burnt forest, logged and burnt forest, and secondary forest, which is forest that's been chopped down and completely regenerated. So we can see that actually our baseline class in most cases is pretty good. So at dawn, using acoustic complexity, it can distinguish between 9 of those classes. So there's a little bit of masking going on, but not a huge amount. You can see the difference, but actually none of the individual narrower bands in their own right were particularly better than the baseline time frequency bands. But what we found when we used all of them combined was that we could always differentiate between all the different forest class pairs. So we could always see the difference between all the different forest classes, which suggested that there was some degree of masking going on. There were at some frequency bands things happening that you couldn't pick up if you measured across those broad acoustic, those broad frequency bins. So that happens at whatever time of day you do it as well. Yeah, so this is sort of a really clear example of this, where you can see that the baseline frequency band still finds 9 of the differences, and none of the other ones are better. But if you use them all together, then you do find all 10 pairs. So we wanted to see actually in practice how much of an impact that masking had, because it doesn't look too bad there. So what we did was we used those acoustic indices to train a random forest to predict our forest classes. The first random forest we trained was just predicting between primary and secondary forest. And we can see the balanced accuracy for that random forest is about 80%, but just for the baseline class. But for using all of the different time frequency bins, we got 99.6% accuracy. So almost all the time it was able to tell the difference between primary and secondary forest, which are our most distinct classes. But I think even more impressively is when you look at all forest classes. So we've now got some really quite similar forest classes here. So the difference between burnt and logged and burnt isn't huge. So we can see here that the accuracy using just the baseline frequency bin was 62.1%. But when we used all of the time frequency bins, we had 88.2% accuracy. So you get a lot more sensitivity when you're measuring acoustic indices at narrower time and frequency bins. And then the final thing we wanted to do was test the fidelity of acoustic indices. So we calculated a range of traditional biodiversity metrics based on 3 manually checked subsets of data and correlated them with the acoustic indices. So the data subsets we used were 6,960 15-second files from between 6 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. with all the birds manually identified. So that's our dawn subset. The same at night from 30 minutes after sunset to the 30 minutes before sunrise. And if you want to know why we use the 15-second files, I've got a preprint out. It's just been accepted in Remote Sensing, Ecology and Conservation on how effective it is to use a wide range of 15-second files rather than longer survey times. And then we did the same at night, but we sonotyped all biophony rather than just having identified birds. We sonotyped groups of sort of frog noise, insect noise, and that sort of thing that was under 4 kilohertz. And we used that manually assessed data to come up with some biodiversity metrics, so fairly traditional ones: species richness, Shannon diversity, Pearlie's evenness, the first axis from an NMDS, and total encounter. So that's the sum of 15-second files each species was encountered in. So here we found some really interesting results when we correlated them with, we correlated our indices scores with the species, with the traditional biodiversity metrics. So for instance, it's quite a busy figure, so I've highlighted some of the important areas. So at night, you would expect 0.3 to 4 kilohertz is essentially the only place that birds vocalize. So you would expect that to have the most accurate correlation with bird species richness and bird diversity. And here we see it's completely inverse to the baseline or any of the other index scores. We get a completely inverse correlation. So you're completely inversing the correlation you see. And we see the same at dawn with bird species richness as well. The baseline correlation is in a completely inverse direction to the correlations we find if we only look at periods where only look in frequencies where birds are likely to be. So conclusions, signal masking can impact indices. You see also the work by Sam Ross, who's done more work on geophonic masking with acoustic indices. Signal masking has a large impact on the sensitivity of acoustic indices to forest disturbance classes. Signal masking can severely impact the fidelity of acoustic indices and can lead to spurious inverse correlations between biodiversity and indicator metrics. It's important to specify frequency and timescale at which indices are calculated in methods, because it's not always clearly written and it can impact the results. And finally, we recommend that acoustic indices are calculated at either a range of time and frequency bins or at a single narrow bin predetermined by a priori ecological understanding of the soundscape. So just applying ecological a priori knowledge, if you're trying to correlate it with birds, then you know roughly the frequency width bins that birds are calling in. for instance, the bioacoustic index was originally intended to only cover the frequency bins that birds call in, but that was in Hawaii. Those frequency bins were determined, so that probably needs local variation. Then that's a really good thing to apply. So thank you very much for listening. I'll take any questions. And just finally, just want to have a little plea with long-term monitoring of data in Brazil has come to a halt for COVID, and we'll hope to restart it in a year or two. But it'd be really good to have conversations with anyone else in the region to try and work out how we can best synchronize that and make it uniform with anything else that's happening in the region, so we can collect data sets that are comparable. So if anyone's interested in having conversations about that, it would be really nice to have those conversations.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Are there any questions to Oliver about the indices? No questions? They are coming. What regions are you interested in specifically? From Cecilia.
Geographic region, do you think, is that?
I think so.
So Amazonia or Brazil, I guess, in terms of geographic region, is, or possibly across South America. I don't know. It would be
yes,
nice.
It's, well, mainly in the tropics, I would say.
Yeah.
No, yes, Brazil or South America. Okay, Yuan is asking if sound distribution across frequency bands is important. Why not include evenness acoustic indices?
So we did slightly include it, and then we got rid of it, and it showed a fairly similar pattern. We ended up with using bioacoustic indices, bioacoustic index and acoustic complexity index for the sake of simplicity, because your own Z-Wave package lets you filter out the frequencies much easier than the other packages do. But I think I don't think it makes a difference. We had similar results with that before that.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Florencia. I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but did you notice saturation of the indices in your study area?
Saturation of the indices.
So that you reach the over limit of some indices, I guess. You know, when they are limited between 0 and 1, that you are really at the limit of it.
No, I didn't. I don't think we did reach saturation of our indices in any of them. I think we did remove the extreme outliers, and some of those were getting close to saturation, but we never had a huge amount of sort of extreme outliers. So I don't think we reached saturation an awful lot.
Okay. Sandra Müller is asking, maybe I missed it, but did you tailor your frequency ranges to your local soundscape and vocalizing community?
Yes, yeah, I chose it fairly subjectively, but they're still fairly broad, and but it was based on, we have to look through our audio data for thousands of hours while I was trying to train a classifier for something else. So I spent hundreds and hundreds of hours flicking through and sort of enjoying looking at the patterns and learning the patterns and learning where things were in the soundscape. And it was just using that.
Okay, thank you. No hand raised. Maybe a simple question, but what would you do now if you have the same thing to do, filtering everything that you have done, and that we ask you to have a tool which is reliable? What will you do? Which index, which way?
I think I'm not sure. I think I would like to spend more time working out the bioacoustic index. I think that's got the strongest signal for birds, and I'm primarily interested in birds, but I think that has the strongest signal for birds. And I'd quite like to look. We have a 2-year annual data set, so I'm going to look at how it changes over the 2 years and see how that compares to some manual.
Okay, over yours. Okay, good. So it's time. So thank you very much, Oliver. Thank you, and thank you for having saved the situation. See you. Bye. So then,